Hello and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to master your music inside FL Studio. This is going to be very similar to my last mastering tutorial, which I posted a few weeks ago, but many people were asking how to do the same techniques only using FL Studio stock plugins. So again, I've simplified it into 5 really simple and easy to follow steps, and it uses only FL Studio stock plugins and 2 free and legal plugins that you can download. So these plugins are a frequency analyzer and a loudness meter, and you can download those. I've left links at the top of the description, so go ahead and download those, and then let's get right into this tutorial. I also want to say as we start that this is a tutorial for beginners, people who are looking to start mastering or are a little bit confused and just want a little bit of clarity on the topic. This is not meant to show how professional mastering is done, and I by no means mean any disrespect to professional mastering engineers who are incredibly talented and skilled at mastering, and there is so much more to mastering than just these 5 steps, but these 5 steps should get you going in the right direction. So let's just start by explaining what's in this session, and then I'll go over the 5 steps briefly, and then I'll go into them in a lot more detail. So at the top here we have the mix that I'm going to be mastering today, that I'm going to be using. It's our song called Right Here. Below it I have a reference track, which is another mix that I'm going to use to sort of judge to see whether I'm in the right sort of tonal balance or sort of overall EQ, you could say. And then below it are some files that I'm going to show later to do with the loudness, but don't worry about those for now. So to briefly go over the 5 steps, the first one is making sure that you have an aim. What are you trying to get out of mastering? Usually in mastering, what we're trying to do is check the track to make sure that there's nothing wrong with it, and then we're trying to make sure that it's ready for release so that it will sound good on many systems, large speakers, headphones, in a car, and then also making sure that it's loud enough so that it's not too loud or too quiet to be posted online. So once we have an aim, the second step is sort of a final check, and this is going to be how to identify problems with the mix. The third step is looking at the tonal balance. So does the mix need any EQ? Does it need boosts or cuts anywhere? The fourth step is going to be limiting the track so that it's loud enough, and how do we know how it is loud enough? We're going to find out with that loudness meter. And then the 5th step is trying any sweetening, so any extra techniques such as stereo widening, to see if you can give anything extra to the mix and really sort of add that extra 1 or 2% to make it really sparkle. So if we go back to step 1, which was having an aim, my aim for this session is to make sure that this track is loud enough for online streaming. It's going to be posted on Spotify and YouTube, and I want to make sure that nothing gets past me. If there's any clicks or pops or resonances in the track, I want to pick up on those now. And I also want to make sure that it sounds good if someone's listening on their phone, or if someone's listening on great big speakers or sort of smaller speakers like this. I want to make sure that this is sounding good on all devices. This is also the right time to get yourself into the right mindset for doing mastering, because mastering is not just something you do by the numbers. It's a creative process, it's a very musical process, and this is a time to get inspired and motivated and enjoy the process and try to relax into it as well. So that's step 1. The next step is our final check. So the first thing we're going to do with this is add fades at the start and the end of the track. So very simply, I'm just going to go onto my master channel here. I'm going to automate the master fader, and I've added in an automation clip to control this fader here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the value at 0 dB, and then I'm going to paste it in at the start, and I'm going to paste it in near the end. Then I'm going to zoom in on the track, and I'm going to fade it up where I'd like the track to begin. So maybe I want the track to begin just here. And I'm going to gently fade up into the track, and again paste that value so that it definitely gets to 0 dB. And I'm going to take a listen to it. That sounds okay to me. And then I'm also just going to do exactly the same thing at the end. I'm going to listen to the tail decaying, and I'm going to pick the point where I want to start fading it. Nice. So now that the track has those fades, there's not going to be a pop or a click at the start, and when someone presses play on the song, there's not going to be a sort of a random jump in volume or anything like that. The next part of this final check is to listen to the song. So when I do this, I like to just close my eyes and listen from start to finish, usually a couple of times. So I'll listen, at a decent volume in the room with the speakers, and then I'll put headphones on and listen again. And what I am listening for as closely as possible is any clicks, any pops. Maybe in the vocal, I've cut a breath in half and it sort of jumps up all of a sudden. I want to make sure that that kind of stuff is nowhere near this mix. If that's happening, I need to go back to the mix and sort it out in the session, and then I need to re-export it and pull it into this mastering session again. The reason I'm mastering in a new session is because it just saves the CPU and the RAM on the computer. It's so much easier to just pull in your final exported file and master in a new project. But anyway, in this final check, I'm just listening to the whole track. Basically, you have to press play at the start, maybe close your eyes or keep them open, do what you want, just listen to it. And you're not allowed to change anything throughout the whole song. You're not allowed to turn it up, you're not allowed to turn it down. You have to be happy with how it sounds from start to finish and know that mastering is not going to save any big problems with the mix. If you find that in the chorus the vocals are too quiet and you want to turn the song up, then you have to go back to the mix and maybe address that by turning the vocals up or turning the instrumental down or something like that so that it sounds good from start to finish. Sometimes a good way to address problems is to use an EQ. So in this case on the master, the first insert is Fruity Parametric EQ2. And you get this by clicking here, going to replace, and then you can find Fruity Parametric EQ2. Sometimes it's useful to just boost a frequency a little bit, make it a little bit narrow, and sort of just sweep across from side to side, and sometimes something will poke out at you. It might help you identify a click or a pop or a resonance. In this track, the guitar had a little bit of resonance in it, and I figured that out by sort of boosting, and then around 300 or so, the guitar really like poked out at me, and then I knew that I had to go back to the mix and sort of duck down that frequency a little bit. So those two steps are sort of the more boring stuff, but now we're actually going to start getting into the audio and really working on it now. So the third step is the tonal balance, or like the distribution and energies of the frequencies in the mix. So we're going to take a listen to the song, and I'm also going to compare it to another mastered song. So in this case, it's one of my other songs. I'm using one of my own songs because I don't want to get a copyright strike. I'm listening to see whether it sounds similar to something I've done in the past that I liked. So I'm going to turn off the mastering processing so that it's not going through any VSTs. I've pulled in this mastered track, but I've also lowered the volume down here so that it's at a similar volume to the other track so that I compare them equally. So let's take a listen to the loudest part of the track. And what I can hear right away is that I thought this mix sounded okay, but when I compare it to this mix at the bottom actually has a lot less bass, is what I'm hearing in this room at least. But I already know that this mix down here was already quite bassy. It's sort of like a sort of future house almost track. It's got a heavy kick, it's got a heavy bass line, but this track at the top still had too much bass. So what I could do now is either go back to the mix and maybe lower the bass drum or lower the sub. But if I don't want to go back to the mix, this is where we take our EQ and we do sort of broad strokes. So we're looking to gently reduce the bass. Now you can do this by either taking like a peaking filter like this and dipping it down slightly, or you can just take like a whole shelf and just take it down ever so slightly. In mastering, when you're beginning, I think it's best to not be poking loads of holes in a mix like this and trying to do dramatic and drastic stuff, because often when you do stuff like that, you just start making mistakes as a beginner. What we're doing is we're just going for the overall picture. If you start making like really particular cuts and boosts like this, you're probably just hearing resonances because of your room and like a lack of acoustic treatment and also just the way your speakers sound, and you're probably not actually hearing problems in the mix. So all I'm doing is I'm just comparing it to something that I know I liked when it was mastered, and I'm seeing if I can just reduce the bass just a little bit. That's the first thing I'm going to do. So let's take a listen and see if we can get this in the right ballpark. So that was a minus 2.5 dB cut on everything from 120 Hertz down. It's not incredibly gentle, but it's also not a very big cut. If I just increase this so you can really see what's going on, it's not like I've done this. So I'm just looking at subtle moves. With mastering, especially with EQs like this, we don't want to be making huge sweeps and cuts. It usually doesn't sound very good. So let's compare the two tracks now. So it's a little bit better, it's a little bit more controlled in the low end. The next thing I'm going to do is take another token and I'm going to change its type to a high pass filter. And then I'm going to change the order to steep 4. Just going to scroll down in the middle. And what I'm going to do is just cut everything out from below about 25 hertz or so. It's good to do this because there's nothing important down there. It's not going to be played back on any system or any headphones or wherever your music's going to be played. If there's anything rumbling in the low end that you can't hear on your speakers, it's better to just get rid of it. It gives you more headroom later. I'm also going to look at the high end to see if I can open up the mix at all. So let's compare the high end now. We're listening to like the hi-hats, the reverbs and whatnots. The hi-hats just sound a little bit more exciting in the mastered track underneath. So again, I'm just going to take a high band and I'm just going to boost it very subtly up here. And it's just kind of added a little bit more excitement, a little bit more brightness to the mix. It just feels slightly more open, but again, it's nothing dramatic. One of the free tools that I mentioned earlier is this span plugin. This can help you see differences in the tonal balance of tracks if you're having trouble sort of hearing them, or maybe your speakers are not so good. So what I did is I just put it onto high resolution mode, and then on the settings, I changed the average time up to about something close to 2000. And the block size is really big, and then the smoothing is on half an octave. And then what happens when you play it is it gives you a curve which sort of represents the distribution of frequencies in your song. So let's play it. And to compare it to the track underneath. And you can just see that the bass was just peaking up a little bit, so it probably is a good thing that we've added that EQ in there. If I now look at the graph with these low frequencies highlighted, we can see the rumbly stuff that's just left behind. All of this stuff down here is the stuff that we're trying to get rid of with this low cut here. I should have explained that the reason we're trying to adjust the tonal balance is because we want it to sound good on lots and lots of devices. If your tonal balance isn't very good, maybe it's too bassy or it's not enough bass, it might sound really good in your room. Like on my speakers here, the song might sound good. But if the song has energy imbalances in some frequency ranges, it means that when you listen to it on a different system like headphones, those frequencies are all going to be stressed in a different way and it might not sound good. And this often happens with beginners where, I mean, it happened to me all the time. I was mixing with these Rockets and the music would sound good in my room, which was just a bedroom at the time. If I played it anywhere else, if I played it in the car or I listened in headphones, it sounded nothing like it did in my bedroom. Whereas if I'd addressed the tonal balance properly, it might actually have sounded a little bit worse in my bedroom, but it may have ended up sounding better on headphones and on other speaker systems, because we're really trying to make it sound good absolutely everywhere. And you have to remember that a lot of people will be listening to your music on a laptop for the first time or on earbuds, and that first impression is really important. And if you do have too much low end, it does sound good on big speakers, but often on a laptop speaker, it just sort of blows it out and it sort of prevents you getting a good loudness. So let's take a look at the next step now that we've addressed the tonal balance. And this is step 4, and it's to do with limiting your track to get it to be at the right loudness. So there's a tool that's going to help us with this. It's the second free plugin I mentioned that's called the Ulean Loudness Meter. And this is an LUFS loudness meter. Now you may have heard of peak loudness, RMS loudness. LUFS is loudness units relative to full scale. Basically, it's the loudness measurement that iTunes, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, all of the places online where your music will be streamed, it's the loudness unit that they are looking at to try and determine whether they're going to turn your track down or leave it where it is. In the past, with the loudness war, people would slam their tracks ridiculously loud, because if it was louder, it's usually perceived as sounding better. But nowadays, because the loudness is sort of equalized, it means that if you push your track really, really loud, it's just going to be taken down. And that louder track, when taken down in volume, will usually sound worse than a track that was submitted that was more quiet. So we're going to be using this to judge our loudness. So we're not really using our ears to judge loudness or how loud it sounds in our room. And I'll show you a few things you want to be looking for on this. And then the actual plugin we're going to use to get the loudness is Maximus. You may have seen other tutorials on Maximus that are going to go into all the different bands and do all sorts of crazy compression and limiting, but I'm going to try and keep this plugin very, very simple if I can. Now, the first thing we want to do is just expand it so we can see what's going on, and you want to make sure you're on the master band here. I've quickly reset this plugin back to standard, and all I want you to focus on right now is just this bit here. This is determining where and how limiting is going to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this point here. I'm going to take it down to minus 1.5 dB. And I'm going to do the same with this point, but I'm going to make sure that it stays on this 45-degree line. What this means is that as we push volume into this, when it hits minus 1.5 dB, it's going to be chopped off so that if possible, no sound will be louder than minus 1.5 dB. Now what we're going to look at, I'm just going to close this down a little bit, what we're going to look at is the pre-gain. And I'm going to just push the gain into this until we've got some gentle limiting happening. And you'll see limiting because you'll see some peak reduction on this over here. And I'm going to look at the Ulean loudness meter. Now the online streaming sites are looking for an integrated loudness of around minus 14 LUFS, but that is across either the whole song or a part of your song. So the loudest part of our song is allowed to be louder than minus 14 LUFS, but we don't want it to be too much louder. So let's take a listen to this and tweak some dials. You want to make sure that you set the loudness at the loudest part of your song, which is what I'm doing here. I'm also just adjusting the attack down because I want to make sure that it clamps onto those peaks absolutely immediately. So what I can see is that the short-term loudness was at about minus 12, and if I played it across a longer section of my song, it might average out to minus 14, but that's something that you're just going to have to check on your song. At any time, you can just press this X button to sort of reset this loudness meter. It's good to sort of take a while to learn how this works and get comfortable with it. But it's not too complicated once you get used to it. Now, often at this point, people get a bit scared of what's going on inside Maximus because there's a lot of dials. As a beginner, I didn't understand what half of this meant. Really, for now, just try to focus on the pre-gain pushing into this. Don't adjust the post-gain because that's just going to push it higher than minus 1.5. We need it to be at minus 1.5 dB so that the online stores have headroom to do their conversions. If you push it louder than that, your track will just end up with problems. It will have distortions or it will have sort of strange artifacts occurring in the high end, usually, is what I hear. And what we're trying to do here is raise the loudness of this track without really altering it in any way if possible. I still want it to sound very punchy. I want it to sound just as wide and just as dynamic if possible. And you will lose some of that by limiting, just naturally, but we're trying to get it to stay as close to the mix as possible. Now what I've got down here, which I was talking about earlier, are 3 versions of the track. So I have one version that's been mastered in green, and this has some medium amount of limiting. So the track was about minus 14 LUFS overall. The one in the middle that's loud was quite a bit further. I pushed it by another 3 or 4 dB. And the one that's very loud, I squashed an awful lot with mastering to the point where it was, at like minus 5 or minus 6 LUFS short term. And what happens is if I play the mix, then the medium, then loud, then super loud, they sort of keep sounding better and better because they get louder and louder and louder each time. So I'm going to just give you a warning, this might get pretty loud. And for a beginner, if you listen to the mix and then you listen to one of the loud versions, you usually just assume that it's better because it gets so much louder that you're sort of fooled into believing it sounds better. And this is something that I see a lot of people getting confused by. I got confused by it at the start as well, because when you hear things that are louder, you're just always fooled into believing they sound better, they sound bassier, they sound fuller, more punchy usually. But if I take the volume of these loud ones down so that they roughly match the mix again, you'll hear that they actually sound a lot worse than the mix. They lose a lot of punch and they lose a lot of their definition, really. So let's take a listen. And when I was comparing those, these ones that were really loud actually ended up sounding really bad because they were just like being squashed and you could hear the compression and the limiting just sucking up and down. It really didn't sound good at all, so I'm going to try and avoid that kind of thing. Now what I'm going to do is the one that had sort of the medium limiting on it, I'm just going to compare the two and see whether it still sounds good. What I hear with the one on the bottom is that the bass is more controlled by that EQ and those changes, and while it's definitely lost a little bit of its punch, most of it's still there. It still sounds wide, still sounds clear, you can still hear what's going on, and nothing really sounds like it's sort of sucking up and down with the track. Like, you can't really hear the limiting as being incredibly obvious on this track. So once we get it to the point that we think it's loud enough for online streaming, so I'm going to turn on all these effects. So it's gone through the EQ, it's gone through Maximus, we've checked it on the loudness meter, we've taken a look at span to compare the tonal balance. The last and sort of final step, step 5, is to try any sweetening. So this is where, if you've got your hands on any plugins that you like, maybe you've downloaded that free stereo imager from Ozone, or you've got like a saturation plugin or a mix bus compressor, this is where you should just try those sorts of effects. Be very careful with these effects, especially if you try stereo imaging. We can do stereo imaging inside Maximus as well, so I'll just show a little bit of that. On the master, I can image it, I can make it wider here, thinner here, or I can go into each band, high, mid and low, and try to image it from there. I'll show you what it sort of sounds like. And you might like the sound of that, or you might want to go into just the high band, and maybe you want to make the high band sound a little bit more wide. And as you can see what I'm doing, don't be afraid to, when you first take a dial, push it to the extremes. Try and really listen to what it's doing and then be a bit more subtle with it. The real take-home message for beginners here is try out these things and don't be afraid to try them. If you've got your hands on some new plugins, whether they're from FL Studio or otherwise, experiment with mix bus compression, experiment with saturation, with stereo imaging, and see whether it enhances your mix. And try to be really honest with yourself. If you think it enhances your mix, you can go with it, but if you've put it on and you just really want it to work, but it doesn't really sound better, don't be afraid of just turning it off again. It's not wasted time. You've spent time learning how to use the plugin. And the last thing to do with the sweetening is make sure that you check on the master, put your mix back into mono, especially if you've tried stereo widening. Take a listen to it in mono, and then turn those effects on and off. If you turn the stereo imaging on, but then you listen to it in mono and it sounds really bad, then you probably want to take the stereo imaging off, or at least sort of rein back on it a little bit. Your song will sound a bit degraded in mono, but it should still sound good enough in mono. A lot of times your music will be played back in mono, unfortunately. Some people will listen to it on their phone or on their laptop. Ideally, everybody would listen to music on headphones or speakers, but that's not always what happens. After you've tried any sweetening ideas, it's time to export the song. So what we're going to do is we're going to select at the top here by right-clicking and dragging. We're going to go from the start of our fade all the way to the end of the other fade. And we're just going to make sure that everything else is muted. We're going to make sure that all of our mastering effects are turned on. And then I'm going to go to File, we're going to go to Export, and we're going to select Wave File. Save it somewhere. And then what we're going to do is we're going to select 24-bit wave depth, high quality, enable insert effects, enable master effects, and cut remainder at the top. We want to make sure that it cuts it exactly where we want it to and doesn't sort of keep trailing off to forever. So then we're just going to click start and it will export our song. So those are my 5 steps for getting started with mastering, but like I said earlier, don't be afraid to dive into all the other aspects of it and find out more about mix bus compression, find out more about sweetening. I talk about that a little bit more in my other video on mastering, which I'll link just here. But thank you very much for watching, and I do hope this has set you in the right direction. Bye for now.